What makes a good setting? Some worlds and universes have really captured the imagination, and there is a palpable sense of eagerness to see more and more of them. And then there's a few hundred others that fall flat, fail to engage, or just don't seem to inspire the same sense of immersion. So what is it exactly that separates the two? Why do some alternate worlds feel like such fertile grounds for storytelling, while others just kind of peter out? In this episode of the Way of Worldbuilding, we're going to tackle that very question. We'll start by identifying exactly what kind of setting it is I'm talking about. There's many different types, and it wouldn't make sense to judge the world building of a single-issue comic book by the same criteria as a grand cinematic universe. With definitions out of the way, we'll quickly run through the 4 fundamental elements that I think many of the best settings share. After that, we'll discuss a few of the most popular settings and how their success, failures, or struggles relate to those 4 points. And of course, it's easy to criticize, but are we capable of doing any better? We'll close out by discussing the original setting that we're trying to create and how you can follow along with our progress. So if the question is, what makes a good setting, we really need to be clear about what it is we're talking about. Ultimately, whether a setting is good or bad is going to be dependent on how well it supports the creative work set within it. So what I want to focus on here is really just one specific kind of setting. This category doesn't have a broadly accepted name, but they're most often referred to as expanded universes or shared universes. What sets them apart is their sandbox approach to storytelling. Various authors and creators are free to tell different narratives from different perspectives, often across multiple forms of media, whether that's games, movies, books, etc. Some of the most famous examples would be things like the Star Wars universe, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Halo, the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, Middle-earth, the Forgotten Realms tabletop setting. There's a lot of universes out there. And their popularity has driven movie studios especially to try and turn various properties into the next big cinematic universe. But after a few high-profile failures, I think it's clear they might not be the best judge of what settings can sustain these massive franchises. There seems to be this attitude that an expanded universe is this thing that any story can evolve into and not dependent on a very specific kind of setting that takes a bit of care and attention to develop on its own. But if we start talking about the failures of Hollywood executives, we're going to be here all day. So rather than dwelling on why so many of these expanded universes seem to fail, there'll be time for that later, let's move on to the 4 elements I think successful ones share. And these are not requirements. There are great settings with none of these characteristics and others with all of them that nevertheless seem to struggle. I see these more as ways to make things easier rather than necessary ingredients, but let's jump in. The first element is an open-ended narrative, and that's obvious, right? If you're looking to develop a universe from which to tell a multitude of stories, that's going to be more difficult if there is one single narrative that the universe revolves around. Ideally, you want a setting that can support any number of stories. Some may have greater consequences to the world than others, but the narrative weight of one isn't overwhelming the rest. We'll talk some more about different examples of this later, but some settings I think do this really well include Star Trek, Fallout, Cyberpunk 2077, Warcraft, and 90% of tabletop role-playing games. Next is a multipolar world. And this is very closely linked to having an open-ended narrative because it's a helpful element in preventing any single storyline from dominating the entire universe. There's a whole geopolitical definition you can look up, but in world-building terms, I like using multipolar to describe settings in which the extent of the universe includes multiple different powerful entities, preferably more than 2. Now that can mean a great number of things, but I think we can boil down the concept using this metaphor. In a unipolar world, good dominates or evil dominates, and any conflict is inherently unfair. In a bipolar world, good and evil are more or less balanced. And in a multipolar world, there are several different varieties of good and several different varieties of evil, plus a few others where it's hard to tell which is which. And good and evil, by the way, is just an example here. We could just as easily be talking about Faction A and Faction B, or competing magic systems, or whatever forces in the world represent opposing or just different sides in a conflict. A perfect example of this would be Warhammer of either the Fantasy or 40,000 variety, A Song of Ice and Fire, Doctor Who, and Dragon Age. In each, there is a multitude of forces that can affect their respective universes, and the conflicts between them are correspondingly more complex. Now, some of you just groaned, seeing rich and immersive included in this next element, and I get it. This term gets thrown around so often in video essays and Reddit posts that I genuinely have no idea what anyone means by it anymore. So I'll provide my own vague, unsatisfactory definition of what vast, rich, and immersive actually means. There are some worlds with no edges to them. No matter where you are within them and what story you're focused on, it doesn't feel superfluous. There is some kind of unique element that makes it narratively interesting. I think an example is going to help here. If the next Pirates of the Caribbean movie took place entirely on land, didn't feature the ocean, and was all about a tavern owner in the middle of the desert, well, there might be a way to make that great, but it sure seems like a bit of a tougher road to get there. Compare that to literally anything set within the Star Wars universe, where any character in any profession anywhere can have a story told about them without too much effort needed to justify it. It all feels like it fits within the universe. The world of Pirates of the Caribbean might have deep lore in places, but its scope isn't quite as vast. It has clear limits to what kind of stories can be told within it, and they mostly line up with the coastlines. Now this one might sound contradictory. How can something be both flexible and consistent? And maybe there's a better way to phrase it, but here's what I mean. Time moves on, the world changes, and public tastes evolve. Some settings are just too grounded in a single genre or idea to stay relevant. A more flexible setting, by contrast, can be just as popular today as it was decades ago. But it needs to stay consistent to its core themes and elements, whatever those might be. Warhammer 40,000 is excellent at this. The grim, dark nature of the universe has always been to the forefront, but if you look at the publications and artwork from the 80s, 2000s, and today, there has been a massive shift that nevertheless feels entirely consistent and appropriate. Now those four elements are just an attempt to make sense of a chaotic mess of world building and narrative ideas that not even the world's heaviest supercomputer could hope to understand. Each of those points bleeds into the others a bit, they connect in weird ways, and they're hardly the only elements we might have talked about. But I think I can show their importance through some examples here. Let's run through a bunch of different franchises, cinematic universes, whatever, and discuss how they might be affected by one or more of my points. I'll have plenty more to say about some of the examples here, so consider this a rapid-fire segment. Star Wars is maybe the best example of a problem we're going to see again and again. There is this incredibly deep, immersive universe, but because it was originally created to be this defined narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, it seems to struggle with how to exist when it's operating outside of that. On the one hand, the creative team behind Star Wars seems eager to tell new stories with new characters and new locations, but it also feels like there is this underlying fear of not properly honoring the original saga, so they try to do a bit of both all the time. Unfortunately, I don't think this current half-measures approach appears to be working. Neither those eager for new stories and those who want the original characters to retain their importance seem very satisfied. The Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett, Ahsoka, and the Solo film all suffer from this to varying degrees. Andor, meanwhile, seems to excel because rather than trying to please everyone, it's taken a firm stand. It might alienate some fans, but I think letting the Skywalker saga go and telling more weird stories that don't rely on it is going to keep things fresh. Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth to me has a very similar problem, where the central narrative, the conflict between good and evil, just dominates everything. So any story that doesn't directly deal with it can feel kind of secondary and unimportant. The Lord of the Rings trilogy might be the greatest set of films ever made, but the attempts to turn Middle-earth into this vast, extended universe never really interested me. The Hobbit trilogy and a few of the video games seem to justify my disinterest. Each tried to shoehorn in some connection with the battle against Sauron and the Pull of the Ring to make it feel relevant and epic, but these attempts always felt just kinda tacked on. Sometimes it was especially dumb, like Gandalf led the Fellowship through the mines of Moria, and then about an hour later, Barry, this guy you've never heard of and never will again, did the exact same thing and helped the Fellowship later on in this really crucial small way. Most attempts to add new stories to Middle-earth seem to rely on this method, to the point where they were weakening the original narrative. Star Wars Legends did that a lot too, by the way. Middle-earth is obviously so detailed and rich, it can support a whole variety of stories. But I think there needs to be greater resistance to the temptation to try and make everything set within it focus on these epic quests with world-shattering consequences. If there was an entertaining story about a small, self-contained adventure, I don't think people would mind too much that it didn't directly reference the War of the Ring or Sauron or whatever. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that future stories should ignore the Pull of the Ring. Easier said than done, I know. Halo is a great example of why multipolarity is important. When that universe only needed to support a trilogy of shooters, it made sense that the conflict between the UNSC and the Covenant completely dominated the setting. But like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, it's now struggling to become the expanded universe it apparently wants to be. Stories set within the Human Covenant War are a good way to build on the foundation that already exists, but there is very little outside of that. What do you do when the Covenant and Flood are defeated? Your universe is suddenly completely out of major conflicts. After the end of the original trilogy and a few spin-offs, the Halo expanded universe tried to solve this by taking smaller elements that used to be vaguely mysterious and in the background, and bringing them into the forefront. But none have managed to replicate the impact the Covenant had during the original games. Personally, I think the Halo universe worked perfectly fine as a set narrative, and didn't need to become the kind of expanded universe with a constantly advancing time frame. Possibly a controversial opinion, but I think the Human Covenant War should represent the entirety of the Halo timeline and not have any stories go beyond it. The setting just wasn't designed for it. I think the 30-year war, though, has plenty of opportunities for interesting narratives, and is enough to support a whole variety of stories on its own. Warhammer 40,000 is one of the best settings ever created, and it scores the highest possible ratings in all 4 of my elements. The team behind it seems incredibly aware of all the points I'm raising, and I think 40k should be used as a case study in how you create the kind of setting we're discussing here. And what's interesting is, I think the 40k community is actually very aware of this too. There is notable pushback when a particular storyline is getting too much attention or certain elements are inconsistent. So if 40k fans are constantly getting annoyed over all the mistakes Games Workshop is making to the lore, I think it's because the universe has established this really high level of quality, and it's subsequently being held to this much greater standard. For a brief moment in time, there was a lot of excited speculation that The Walking Dead was going to be the next big franchise. And there's still time for this to happen, but it doesn't seem very likely. The problem in my view always came down to its lack of flexibility. There are quite a few different stories you can tell within the zombie genre, but most of them are going to boil down to essentially the same two. A group of survivors is looking for a new sanctuary after their old one was destroyed, and a group of survivors is defending their new sanctuary until it's destroyed. Even the zombies tend to lose their menace over time. To become a really versatile extended universe, The Walking Dead needs some new elements, something that can move it beyond the strict confines of the zombie genre. The problem is, it can't really do that without diluting the whole essence of the show. Now, I haven't exactly been paying attention, but it does seem like some of these elements are now beginning to appear, with new mutated types of zombies, but I just don't think The Walking Dead really needed to become this massive universe supporting all different kinds of shows. Another universe that would score very high in pretty much every category is Fallout. In terms of its open-ended narratives and multipolar settings, it's pretty much perfect. Every game in the series seems to almost effortlessly offer a wide array of stories. But we're in the unique position now, where we have an example of a new universe, constructed along an almost identical model to Fallout's, that I think has some major problems. Starfield presents a setting that should be wide open for storytelling, and yet it feels instead kind of confined. It has a multitude of factions, expansive lore, and the same open-ended narrative, but it comes down to a question of scale. In Fallout, when you arrive in the capital wasteland, you'll encounter maybe a few dozen factions, some big, some small. Move over to the Mojave, and you'll find a few dozen more. As more games are produced, the Fallout world grows more complex and intricate. But when you arrive in the settled systems, you'll encounter those same few dozen factions. But in Starfield, this represents the extent of the universe. There is no other place to go. The mercenaries you encounter are not just local to this one area, but the only mercenaries across the whole of the universe, it would seem. Future installments of this series will no doubt add greater depth and variety, but right now, Starfield feels narratively crippled. It's hard to imagine what another game in the franchise or new stories might offer, other than a retread of what we've seen before. If each game instead took place in a different section of the settled systems, each with its own unique factions and stories, I think this wouldn't be a problem. Talk, of course, is cheap. Would we be capable of doing any better if we tried to build our own fictional universe? Well, that's what this series is all about. Tomorrow, October 4th, 2023, we'll be releasing a video covering the first of 3 original settings that might become the case study for this whole series. The other 2 settings will be covered over the following days, and on Friday, October 6th, the polls will open right here on YouTube, and you'll be able to vote for which idea you'd like to see expanded into a fully fledged setting. The development of that setting is happening on a separate YouTube channel, so there's a link in the description if you'd like to follow along with our progress. I'm excited for you to see the ideas we've come up with, but until then, good luck and good world building.